Good morning, everyone, and today we will be reporting Hong Kong, the first Asian tiger. Hong Kong, along with fellow Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, went through rapid growth by going through industrialization. Named the first among these four Asian tigers, the economy of Hong Kong started to take off as early as 1950s. Hong Kong today exists as a special administrative region controlled by the People's Republic of China and enjoy its own limited autonomy as defined by the Basic Law. The principle of one country, two systems allows for the coexistence of socialism and capitalism under one country, which is mainland China. The whole territory has been inhabited since the Old Stone Age, later becoming part of the Chinese Empire with its loose incorporation into the Qin dynasty. Starting out as a farming and fishing village and salt production site, it became an important free port and eventually a major international financial center as it is today. From being the first Asian tiger, Hong Kong is now known as one of the world's best tourist destinations and Asia's world city. Allow me and my team to walk you through the development of Hong Kong. Let's begin with background and its history. The long history of China has significant influence and impact on Hong Kong's, as the former southernmost part of its territory. The history of Hong Kong itself can be divided into four periods: the early period, the imperial period, the colonial period, and the modern period. For today's discussion, we will be focusing on the colonial period and its transition to the modern period. However, we will also be touch basing some of important activities or happenings during the imperial period. This is so we understand on how and why Chinese Empire have handed over the Hong Kong to British Empire and after more than 100 years return it back to the Chinese government. Let's first discuss the Opium War. Between 1839 and 1842, British forces fought a war in China that benefited drug smugglers. Their subsequent victory in the conflict opened up the lucrative Chinese trade to British merchants. The roots of the Opium War or First China War lay in a trade dispute between the British and the Chinese Qing dynasty. By the start of 19th century, the trade in Chinese goods such as tea, silks, and porcelain was extremely lucrative for British merchants. The problem was that the Chinese would not buy British products in return. They would only sell their goods in exchange for silver, and as a result, large amounts of silver were leaving Britain. In order to stop this, the East India Company and other British merchants began to smuggle Indian opium into China illegally, for which they demanded payment in silver. This was then used to buy tea and other goods. By 1839, opium sales to China paid for the entire tea trade. The second picture shows an opium plant and flower. About 12 to 15% of the composition of the fruit and flower can be used as an analgesic, which is being utilized by both Chinese and British as a medical and recreational use. So imagine the great need for the opium. The Chinese wanted to stop the trade. Although opium was valued as a medicine that could ease pain, assist sleep, and reduce stress, by 1840 there were millions of addicts in the country. Illegal opium imports were also eroding what had once been a favorable balance of trade. The British believed the Chinese had always been uncooperative, having allowed only one port, which is Canton, to be used by the Western merchants since 18th century. After several skirmishes, fighting began in November 1839. HMS Volage and HMS Hyacinth, both are British naval forces, defeated 29 Chinese vessels during the evacuation of British refugees from Canton. Negotiations began between the British and the Chinese emperors. Lord Palmerston, The Foreign Secretary demanded compensation and the granting of an island off the coast for use as a trading station. The Chinese refused, and on January 7, 1841, the British captured the Bogue forts Fort Chien Pi and Tai Kok To that guarded the mouth of the Pearl River. The British continued moving forward north, capturing Chapu on 18th of May 1842, in an operation that witnessed brave Chinese resistance. Many Chinese only surrendered after their defenses had been breached and their enclosures set on fire by rockets. The war ended on 17th of August 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking enabling the British to carry on their mercantile transactions with whatever persons they pleased. The treaty committed the Chinese to free trade including the trade in opium. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, and the treaty ports of Guangzhou, Amoy, Fuzhou, Shanghai, and Ningpo were open to all traders. The Chinese also paid reparations. Hong Kong was originally ruled by China up to the Qing dynasty in 1842 when the Treaty of Nanking ceded the island to the British Empire. An important date to remember, in 1842, again, China cedes Hong Kong Island to Britain after the First Opium War, and over the decades, thousands of Chinese migrants fleeing domestic upheavals settled in the colony. The treaty later expanded to include the Kowloon Peninsula in 1860, after the Second Opium War. This was then named Perpetual Lease. And in 1898, by the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory, the treaty seeks to lease the new territories for 99 years. In 1890s, Hong Kong was already a busy port. This picture was taken after the passing of a damaging typhoon. Just a keynote from our previous slides, in 1898, China leases the new territories together with 235 islands to Britain for 99 years from July 1st of that year. In 1937, with the outbreak of Sino-Japanese War, Hong Kong becomes a refugee for thousands of mainland Chinese fleeing before the advancing Chinese. Officially in 1941, Japan occupies Hong Kong. Food shortages impel many residents to flee to mainland China. The population drops from 1.6 million in 1941 to 650,000 by the end of Second World War. This picture shows Japanese forces seize Hong Kong in 1941. In 1946, Britain reestablishes civil government. Hundreds of thousands of former residents return, to be joined over the next few years by refugees fleeing the civil war between the nationalists and the communists in China. In 1950s, Hong Kong enjoys economic revival based on light industries such as textiles. As mentioned in our introduction, Hong Kong economy began to take off as early as 1950, thanks to the textile industry. In 1960s, social discontent and labor disputes become rife among poorly paid workforce. In 1967, severe riots break out, mainly instigated by followers of China's Cultural Revolution. In the late 1960s, living conditions improve and social unrest subsides. In 1970s, Hong Kong is established as an Asian tiger, one of the region's economic powerhouses, with a thriving economy based on high technology industries. In 1982, Britain and China begin talks on the future of Hong Kong. In 1984, Britain and China signed joint declaration on the conditions under which Hong Kong will revert to Chinese rule in 1997. Under the one country, two systems formula, Hong Kong will become part of one communist-led country but retain its capitalist economic system and partially democratic political system for 50 years after the handover. This picture shows the Sino-British talks preceded the 1984 Joint Declaration on Reversion to Chinese Rule. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a treaty signed between the United Kingdom and China on Hong Kong under Chinese sovereignty. In 1989, the massacre of pro-democracy demonstrators in Beijing's Tiananmen Square leads to call for the introduction of further democratic safeguards in Hong Kong. In 1990, Beijing formally ratifies Hong Kong's post-handover mini-constitution or Basic Law. In April of 1992, Chris Patten becomes last British governor of Hong Kong with a brief to oversee the colony's handover to China. In October of 1992, Chris Patten announced his proposal for the democratic reform of Hong Kong's institutions aimed at broadening the voting base in elections. China is outraged that it has not been consulted and threatens to tear up business contracts and overturn the reforms after it has taken control. This picture shows Governor Chris Patten receiving the Union Jack flag after it is lowered for the last time at Government House. The Union flag, or Union Jack, is the national flag of the United Kingdom. It is so called because it combines the crosses of the three countries under one sovereign, the kingdoms of England and Wales, of Scotland and of Ireland. In December 1992, Hong Kong's stock market crashes. In June 1994, after nearly 2 years of bitter wrangling, Hong Kong's legislature introduces a stripped-down version of Chris Patten's democratic reform package. The new legislation widens the franchise but falls far short of providing the universal suffrage. In 1995, elections held for new Legislative Council (LegCo). In July 1997, Hong Kong is handed back to the Chinese authorities after more than 150 years of British control. Tung Chee-hwa, a Shanghai-born former shipping tycoon with no political experience, is handpicked by Beijing to rule the territory following the takeover. In May 1998, the first post-handover election was held. In February 2001, Deputy Chief Executive Anson Chan, a former deputy to Chris Patten and one of the main figures in the Hong Kong administration to oppose Chinese interference in the territory's affairs, resigns under pressure from Beijing and is replaced by Donald Chang. In June 2002, trial of 16 members of the Falun Gong spiritual movement arrested during a protest outside Beijing's liaison office in the territory. Falun Gong remains legal in Hong Kong despite having been banned in mainland China in 1999, and the trial is seen as a test of the freedoms Beijing guaranteed to respect after their handover. The 16 are found guilty of causing a public obstruction. In September 2002, Tung Chee-hwa's administration releases proposal for controversial new anti-subversion law known as Article 23. Hong Kong Basic Law Article 23 is an article in the Basic Law of Hong Kong. It states that Hong Kong shall enact laws on its own to prohibit any act of treason, secession, sedition, subversion against the Central People's Government, or theft of state secrets, to prohibit foreign political organizations or bodies from conducting political activities in the region, and to prohibit political organizations or bodies of the region from establishing ties with foreign political organizations or bodies. March to April 2003, both China and Hong Kong are hit by the pneumonia-like SARS virus. Strict quarantine measures are enforced to stop the disease. Hong Kong is declared free of SARS in June. July 2003, a day after a visit to the territory by Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, 500,000 people marched against Article 23. Two Hong Kong government members resigned. The bill is shelved indefinitely. This picture just shows rallies against Article 23. In April 2004, China rules that its approval must be sought for any changes to Hong Kong's election laws, giving Beijing the right to veto any moves towards more democracy, such as the direct elections for the territory's chief executive. In July 2004, some 200,000 people marked the 7th anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to Chinese rule by taking part in a demonstration protesting Beijing's ruling against electing the next chief executive by universal suffrage. Britain accuses China of interfering in Hong Kong's constitutional reform process in a manner inconsistent with the self-governance guarantees agreed before the handover. September 2004, pro-Beijing parties retained their majority in Legco elections, widely seen as a referendum on Hong Kong's aspirations for greater democracy. In the run-up to the poll, human rights groups accused Beijing of creating a climate of fear aimed at skewing the result. December 2004, Chinese President Hu Jintao delivers public rebuke to Tung Chee-hwa, telling him to improve his administration's performance. In 2007, marked 10 years since the city's handover from British to Chinese rule. Fast track in 2017, Hong Kong celebrated the 20 years since the city's handover from British to Chinese rule. That ends my report, and the succeeding reporters would tackle geography and nature, all about its people, government, and economy. Thanks, guys.